And one of the things that's interesting about this is we now have a pretty clear picture, and most people don't realize this, of how people, in general terms, of how people think and why they have feelings and feel the ways they do when they think the kinds of things they do, and of the relationship between thought and emotion. And it's very, very relevant to issues of religion in a couple of ways. One is that religious theories, religious belief systems in general actually embody a lot of theories about things in the world, like what's moral, what moral reasoning is like or is supposed to be like, what's right and true, like do the gods tell you things, do your ancestors give you advice, is somebody going to punish you in the afterlife, and things like that. So actually knowing how minds work, how cultures work, in general shows that the religious belief systems about, the religious belief system within a culture generally embodies certain theories about how minds work and how morality works and how that culture works, and in general they're not true. And if you actually do understand how minds work and how cultures work, you can tell that. Another thing that's interesting to atheists or people interested in atheism is that if this stuff is not true, if religious belief systems by and large are based on various kinds of errors, then why do people systematically make those kinds of errors? And there's a lot of different theories about that kind of thing. And the picture is getting clearer and clearer in cognitive psychology and cognitive anthropology of what really are the causes, what's the actual nature of religion and the causes of religion. So I want to talk about a couple of books. The first one is How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker. So this is a really well-written book. I'm going to talk about a fair number of cognitive science ideas, and this is the book I would recommend for anybody who's not very well versed in this. It's a really excellently written book. Pinker is a brilliant writer, and he's a very smart guy, and I agree with most of the stuff in the book, especially the first two-thirds. Everybody ought to read the first two-thirds of How the Mind Works. And the last third, there's more speculative things that a lot of cognitive psychologists would disagree with his particular take on certain things. But I think the first two-thirds is mostly uncontroversial among people who are experts on this kind of thing, and it's very well written. So it's a fairly trustworthy book. Another book I want to talk about, if we have enough time, is Religion Explained by Pascal Boyer. And this is specifically about the cognitive psychology and cognitive anthropology of religion. Boyer is an anthropologist who goes off to Africa and works with various people and talks to them about how they think, and he talks to other anthropologists who talk to various other people. And what he's trying to do is come up with a fairly detailed picture of what kinds of religion are essentially possible or impossible. What kinds of things are religious beliefs, and what kinds of things can become religious beliefs, can be integrated into a religion. Why do cultures incorporate certain things and exclude others? So if you're specifically interested in religion and you can absorb material pretty quickly, then you might want to go and read Religion Explained. If you want to take it a little slower and you want to learn something about cognitive psychology, which is very fascinating stuff in itself, then I'd recommend How the Mind Works by Pinker.
As for what kind of things can be included in a religion, though, isn't that practically anything in a society? I mean, essentially, they have religious strictures on how to live your sex life, how to comb your hair, how to, what you should eat.
In a certain sense, I mean, there's this amazing zoo of things that can be in a religion. Yeah. But there's an even bigger, not so amazing zoo of things that can't.
Okay.
So, for example, religions very seldom incorporate things that are fairly obvious. Because, if your religion says, there's such a thing as gravity, and that's important to our religion.
Okay.
Well,
good point.
there's no point. And religions also tend to incorporate things that bear on certain kinds of issues people find important. Okay. So, for example, there is no religion, and it's unlikely that there ever would be one, that says God is omniscient on every other Tuesday. And
He has
anyway,
his good days, he has his bad days.
and he doesn't care very much. You know, he basically, religions incorporate things that serve certain functions in a belief system that people are prone to explaining things that way. And so as an anthropologist, he's looking at lots of cultures, certain cultures he's lived in and other cultures he's gone and lived in and studied. And lots of other cultures other people have studied. And he has sort of these lists of, you could find this kind of thing in a religion, but you'd never find this kind of thing in a religion. And some of it's pretty amusing to read. Okay. One of the surprising things to many people about psychology is it's really gotten a lot better in the last 50 years. If you're looking at experimental psychology, there was a big problem starting with Freud roughly, that Freud wasn't nearly as scientific as he liked to think he was, and he built a cult of personality around himself. And a lot of people just thought he was such a genius that he had it all figured out, when really a lot of it he was just sort of making up. And basically, since roughly World War II, enough people have been disgusted with, on the one hand, Freudianism, and on the other hand, behaviorism, which was a reaction against Freud that went too far the other way, that they've started doing more careful analysis of the concepts of psychology, more careful experiments that actually reveal deep things about how the mind works. And one of the really important things was the rise of the computer and the idea of the computer, even before computers were actually common and most people had them. And the emerging view that I ascribe to, I'm a computer scientist myself, is that the mind is basically pretty much like a computer program, and the brain is a computer, literally a computer, not just metaphorically, but not a whole lot like the computer on your desk if you have one. So the brain is a computer and the mind is a program running in that computer. And the task of psychology, as cognitive scientists see it, is to explain what that hardware is like, why it can do the things it can do, how it does the things it can do, and what program it's running. Why do we think certain thoughts and not others? And in general, cognitive psychology has been very successful using a lot of different tools. In particular, started out actually well before 50 years ago. This started when people found out that people with certain kinds of brain injuries think differently from the rest of us. And when you look at abnormal brains and the ways abnormal brains malfunction, somebody who's had a part of their brain damaged by disease or an accident or whatever, you find out that certain regions of the brain do certain parts of thought. They think about certain kinds of things. They process visual information in certain ways. They process sound in certain ways. They serve a certain role in remembering things and not other kinds of things. And so if you go and selectively damage different parts of the brain, and they can do this in non-human animals and experiments, you find out that the brain physically is mostly a collection of little computers that serve certain computational tasks. It's one big computer made out of billions of tiny ones grouped into modules that do some task, like, for example, the retina of the eye is actually part of your brain. The sensors and nerves in the eye itself are actually part of your brain that sticks out. And when you look at the world and you see things, you take that for granted. You just think, well, I got some eyes that plugged into my brain so I can see. But there's actually vast, vast amounts of computation and many different kinds of computation going on in the neurons that make, starting with the retina, and going back through several different layers in your head. So, for example, the retinal cells, they communicate with their neighbors. So a retinal cell that's looking at part of what you're looking at communicates with the retinal cells adjacent to it to enhance contrast. They'll sharpen up edges. So the image processing computations start in the eye and then are piped back to the back of your head. And in the back of your head you have another stage of visual processing where the image that you're looking at with the edges enhanced and a few things like that, actually when you turn your eyes, it slides around. This pattern of activation slides around the back of your brain. And then there are several different layers of neurons that process that image and detect features in it. You have line detectors and texture detectors and various kinds of color processors and things like that that are performing this task that seems really easy, and most people have always taken it for granted. Vision is just something humans can do. Why think about it? But the more you study this kind of thing, the more you realize it's computation. It's vast amounts of computation. So that, for example, just to know where this cup is and to know that it's a cup requires many, many stages of processing, all of which involve a lot of guesswork and a lot of computation.